News junkies are forgiven if they've never heard before of gallium and germanium. That's all about to change. If our growing general knowledge of the physics periodic table seemed timed with the visit to Beijing of the US Treasury Secretary, it's because China's announcing controls on the exports of key rare minerals that only it produces. Minerals essential for microchips as well as electric vehicles, fiber optic cables. And after the recent ban on US memory chip maker Micron, the Chinese seem to be fuming over last week's decision by the Netherlands to tighten rules on the export of its ASML chip-making machines, the Dutch invoking national security reasons. Can the West have it both ways? Trade with a nation that's more than ever the planet's factory, and the reshoring of key industries in this an age of digital transformation, upheaval, and scaled up superpower tensions. It's not just China flexing its muscle. The Wall Street Journal reports that just as the Biden administration has dispatched Janet Yellen to Beijing to play good cop, it's also working on ways to restrict China's access to cloud computing. Hard bargaining and a bit of bluff? Or is this the end of trade and the global order as we've known it the past 3 decades? Today in the France 24 debate, what happens when the chips are down between superpowers? With us, commentator and security affairs analyst Xiaowan Shen. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Mathilde Villiers is a research fellow of geopolitics and technology at the think tank IFRI. Welcome.
Thank you.
From Bordeaux, economics professor Jean-François Huchet, rector of the French School of Oriental Languages and Civilizations, INALCO. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
And from Nancy in eastern France, André Lezecoq-Petry, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Nice to see you.
Good evening, François.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. News agencies characterize this as a low-key welcome for Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, putting out a tweet a couple hours ago about the pursuit of, quote, a healthy economic competition that benefits American workers and firms, and to collaborate on global challenges. Shirley Sitbon has more.
Officially, Janet Yellen and her Chinese counterparts share a common goal: easing the ongoing trade dispute between the two countries. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who visited China before Janet Yellen a few weeks ago, quoted her words.
As Secretary Yellen testified before Congress last week, it would be, as she put it, disastrous for us to decouple and stop all trade and investment with China.
Decoupling is the right word. The world's biggest economies are interdependent. They're each other's largest trading partners. China exported $536 billion worth of goods to the U.S. last year, while the U.S. exported $154 billion. The U.S. trade deficit is what triggered former President Donald Trump's trade war with China. And the battle for leadership in highly sensitive technology has escalated their rivalry. The U.S. and its allies, fearing high tech would be used by the Chinese military, have curbed Beijing's access to some advanced computer chips. Earlier this week, China, who is the world's first producer of rare metals necessary to make those microchips, said it will curb exports. Janet Yellen's goal is to ease tensions, but the U.S. is believed to, at the same time, be preparing new measures that could worsen the crisis. The Wall Street Journal reports the U.S. could restrict Chinese companies' access to U.S. cloud computing services, and it could restrict artificial intelligence chip exports.
André Lezecoq-Petry, the last time you were on with us, it was when Antony Blinken was in Beijing. At the time, we were saying how far from the camera was where the most interesting stuff was happening. This is all about keeping the dialogue going. Although the optics don't look great, it seems from here that it's gotten worse, not better, since then.
Yeah, we seem that there's now a tit for tat. I mean, ASML's decision, the Netherlands' decision to restrict export of these machines were key to produce the high-end chips is just June 30. so 5 days ago, and the Chinese reacted with export licenses for these two critical components. And I can't help think that France and Germany is somewhat hinted at gallium or germanium. Just for our viewers, gallium is critical for the most advanced chips that are using less energy. It's also essential to produce photovoltaic panels. It's essential for performance, power performance chips for electric vehicles. So it's absolutely critical for our energy transition. And germanium is used in devices such as night vision goggles. So you can see the national security impact of it. So we feel that beyond the talks and the welcoming links and visits, at least people are talking. That's good. The competition is heating up.
Yeah, the Chinese Commerce Ministry insists that export controls don't mean export bans, and they don't target any specific country. However,
for a while, the U.S. has been abusing export measures, strengthening its suppression and containment of China's semiconductors and splitting the global market. This is a destruction to global free trade, ignorance of international trade rules, as well as a trampling of the principle of fair competition.
Xiao Wanzhen, is that just the usual rhetoric out of Beijing, or it sounds pretty ominous there?
Yeah, I mean, I think China has certain concerns about these export in terms of the trade war and the conflict between the United States and China. So these export restrictions, I think, make sense as kind of a countermeasure. I think internally as well, China, there's been a lot of pressure since China has reined in a new economics team under Xi Jinping. And so as Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen would be meeting these new team members in China as we speak. So it would be very interesting to see kind of the reactions and kind of what sort of concessions or resolutions from this meeting would come about.
Jean-François Huchet, who's got who over a barrel here? You just heard André describe just how critical these rare minerals are. And yet you look at China's economy right now, the recovery is not going the way it wanted. Foreign investment is way down, and it risks deflation. So who's got the better hand?
Well, definitively there is a difficult moment for the Chinese economy. And also the Chinese government is also taking some measures to control, for example, access to different markets, to also the dissemination of information. And I think all the foreign companies are quite worried about some restriction put on their activities. There is also some political issues about spying also.
There's a new counter-espionage bill that's just been passed.
Exactly. So there is quite a lot of worries coming from foreign companies in China. It's not that there is a total stop on the foreign direct investment, but I think most of the companies now are applying this de-risking strategy, which means that they are trying to diversify their not only the source of sourcing, but also in the chain value. They are trying to diversify the location where they could produce around the world. So yes, it's difficult for the United States with this ban of rare metal, but rare earth. But we had that already a couple of years ago, and I think different countries are starting again to produce those rare earth and to put into production. But it takes years to, of course, to come to be able to produce those critical rare earth. But I think at the end of the day, so far, I think China has more to lose on this game.
China has more to lose. Mathilde Vellier.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I was going to say a similar thing because the difference, I think, is that the export control on the two minerals you mentioned, the rare earth that are targeted are not actually very rare. It's true that China is very dominant in their production and therefore have leverage on this. I think that, if I remember correctly, the data, China has the production of 60% of germanium and 80% of gallium. So that's obviously massive. But the difference is that it's not that the US or Europe do not know how to produce these rare earths or do not possess it.
But you just heard Jean-François Huchet say it takes a while to pivot if you want to start ramping up production.
Exactly. So the thing is, it will take time, but it's not something that, necessarily speaking, they don't know how to do. Whereas on the other end, the controls imposed, for instance, by the US or by the Dutch or by the Japanese target something that China does not master yet, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the chips themselves.
Yeah, and it was last Friday, the Dutch government deciding on export controls, what with this company ASML, the country's largest company, by the way, by market capitalization. It's been hit with new rules by the Dutch government requiring a license to export its world-leading chip-making machines.
Ultimately, we want to ensure that Dutch technology does not end up in the hands of companies or organizations where it can be used against us. This is about national security. There are concerns about safety regarding China, but also other countries that import those machines.
Definitely a bad news story for folks attending the World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai.
It's very simple. You cannot make chips without a chip-making machine. It's that logical.
André de Pietri, why is the Netherlands involved in all this?
Well, so ASML is a Dutch company. It's a private company, but obviously we have entered the world where there's no such thing as something which is purely economic. It makes our time so exciting and so frightening at the same time. It has been actually several years now that the US in particular have lobbied, we can call it like that, Europe and as well as Japan to put more restrictions on their critical ASML is at the core of the value chain, like the person who was interviewed just mentioned. And let me put also the relationship between AI and ASML. ASML is producing the machines that are able to produce the most advanced chips, those with the smallest nodes, so 3 nanometers, 5 nanometers. And those chips are exactly those who are currently being used for training large language models in particular. One of the biggest company producing these chips is called NVIDIA, has just passed the $1,000 billion capitalization mark. So this is where there is a relationship. If you need these AI accelerators, as we call these chips, you need these machines. And that's where the ban out of, or the restriction out of the is so key. So we're really seeing a chess game played at the global level. And I would just like to make one point to make it even more complex, to complement what our colleague from IFRI said. There's not just a production problem. China patiently, since 15 years, strategically, has built not only production dominance, but refining dominance. So not only so it has put itself at the center of refining these matters, and this is probably one of the core questions for our societies. We might have these minerals. It takes an average 8 to 10 years to open a mine, but on top of that, it's pretty dirty, sometimes radioactive, to refine these minerals. So we need, in our energy transition, to basically have a compromise between the fear of missing out and the concept of not in my backyard. We love these materials, we love these batteries, we love these permanent magnets for offshore windmills, but please don't produce that close to us. So this is really a question for our Western societies to answer. And we need to be so much more strategic. We cannot say we didn't see it happen. In 2010, the Chinese imposed a ban on rare earths to Japan. And Japan, in 8 years, from 2010 to 2018, diminished their dependency by 60%. So it's possible, but you need foresight. So policymakers need to ramp up their competence on strategic foresight, definitely.
Mathilde Villiers, on this point?
Yes, definitely. And I think that what's interesting is that the great strength of the US is that they managed to actually internationalize their restrictions.
So they leaned on the Dutch, is what you're saying?
They definitely leaned on the Dutch quite heavily, as well as on the Japanese, which had different understanding and were maybe more prone initially to impose these controls. But they definitely leaned very heavily on the Dutch since the end of the Trump administration, with a whole set of tools, diplomatic tools, sort of commercial veiled threat of retaliation, saying that, for instance, ASML needed some US lasers, therefore they should maybe not, they could be maybe leveraged into imposing US controls. And of course, diplomatic tools with potentially incentives that are obviously not public. And so they really managed to discuss things multilaterally in the multilateral instances of export controls, as well as bilaterally with the Dutch, for instance. They tried even to see if they could use the extraterritoriality of their law, but it couldn't actually work since they really are Dutch machines. But they really worked to sort of create coalition to be able to implement their export controls more generally, because obviously if you just target with US restrictions, you can only reach, even extraterritorially, mostly US product or a US produced product. Therefore, it's less efficient, and they really managed to make it broader. And I think they're definitely continuing this effort internationally.
Zhao and Shen, on that point, is the U.S. We're ahead of a NATO summit next week. Mm-hmm. Are they leaning more than before on their allies to?
Yeah, I think so. To some level, I think the U.S. And particularly is looking to Europe, for instance, to kind of restrict China's kind of, I wouldn't say dominance, but their progress in geopolitically and politically and diplomatically.
What do you do with countries like Italy and Greece, which have had warm trading ties with China in particular?
I mean, that's why you have the European Union, for instance, that has been trying to consolidate a China policy. It's very interesting because just Wednesday, for instance, Lithuania, which is where the NATO summit will be held, they had actually published a paper saying that Taiwan is one of the strategic priorities for itself. And
Lithuania is the most pro-Taiwan country, and that's where the NATO summit is happening. The most pro-Taiwan of the European Union.
Exactly. I think that also sends a very strong significance to China that NATO, in particular, is looking towards the Asia-Pacific region.
All right. You can't disassociate the politics from the business. But while the U.S. government tightens the screws, Elon Musk was addressing that same conference in Shanghai where we heard that disgruntled participant a moment ago, and really courting the Chinese market on things like AI. Jean-François Huchet, we have this dissonance, don't we, with the private sector, which wants to keep on doing business with China, and the strategic goals of world leaders in times of tensions over things like the war in Ukraine, Taiwan, and policing the Pacific.
Yes, well, it's a long story. If we look back before China entered the WTO agreement, we had every year a review based on human rights policy made at the U.S. Congress, and at that time you had very fierce battles of lobbying between different firms who were, trying to make sure that the Congress will vote in favor of giving the most favored nation status to China. So it's not something really new. What is different at the moment is that the power of the U.S. government is now leaning towards protectionism, economic nationalism, and also obviously worries that China at the military level will use those technologies to fight against US. So
is the US flexing its muscle under Joe Biden more than under Donald Trump, or is it the same?
Well, it's continuing. It's a bipartisan, really agenda that we have here. It started with Barack Obama at the end with some different policies, and then Trump obviously was very vocal about that and really transformed that bipartisan policy into some real action. Joe Biden is doing less noise, I would say, but is continuing and imposing still more restriction on policies. But of course, you have some private companies in the US who have high stakes on the Chinese market. And they are not really happy about what's going on at the moment, and they have to play with geopolitical issues, and it's quite difficult for them. So I'm sure that we will continue to have for a while some private company who do think that the Chinese consumers and the Chinese market are extremely important for them.
Yeah, we get mixed messages from politicians. We saw last month the French president attending the Vivatech trade fair, and the French government has been urging China's BYD to build an electric car factory in this country. It's interesting, André Lozucug-Petri, because BYD, there's some saying that that could really clobber the competition, in particular French makers Renault and Stellantis.
Yeah, I think it's very short-sighted. I think just to go back on Biden versus Trump, I think Biden is a Trump on China with a plan and with a strategy, and we should not forget that at the White House in the West Wing. There are 140 PhDs in the Office of Science and Technology advising the president. So we have a US president who has a very strategic approach to technology and interlinking that with national security. And as Jean-François mentioned, this is a bipartisan topic. I think we lack this plan. We still, in Europe, think on one side jobs, which in the area of electric vehicles is a thing of the past. I mean, no skilled worker has problems to find a job today in France in this area.
So you're saying it's a bad idea? What you're saying is that it's a bad idea for Emmanuel Macron to be courting BYD to build a factory here?
I'm not going to comment on the president, but I think thinking that this is it's tactically maybe wise, because it's always good to open factories at the moment where we need to reindustrialize. And we have begun to realize in France that actually going to 10% of GDP, even less than 10% of GDP for the industrial sector, actually has a catastrophic impact on the whole value chain, because you cannot have research centers which are disconnected from the industrial base. So that is what we begin to realize, and a bit late. So it's important to attract factories, but I think it would make much more strategic sense to ensure that European players are ramping up much faster, not necessarily by directing direct subsidies to them, but by giving them a precise goal where we want to be, and be strategic also. Why don't clearly say that your electric vehicles will need to have European batteries, European technologies inside, if they want to fully benefit subsidies to buy electric car, or even to address the European market.
So you're arguing for the same protectionism that Jean-François Huchet was pointing out for the United States.
No, I think we need to be strategic. I think we need to know where we want to go. It's not about today. The goal is not anymore about creating jobs. The goal is about how do we ensure that the best brains, the best researchers, and the best industry stays in Europe, and that we benefit from it, and that we benefit from the whole supply chain, and not from individual parts like, I don't know, an e-commerce giant who has only its packaging center, but where most of value is captured somewhere else, or just a finishing line for a car factory without the research center which is associated. So we need to have this transversal view where we mix research, engineering, jobs, and also the whole aftermarket, if you think about automotive. And I think this interdisciplinary approach is very difficult because it makes problems of today, again, where politics and economics come together, so much more difficult than in the so-called good old days where it was very much working in silos. And I think, yes, clearly, we lack the strategic thinking that we see today, unfortunately, in authoritarian countries, but that we also see today in China, in the US.
In the US, I was going to say. So, Mathilde Villiers?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to come back to your analysis of the Biden administration. I fully agree with you, and I think that they definitely have the same goal than the Trump administration. They're just way more sophisticated, and they know the rules better. And now that the Trump administration has sort of done some regulatory innovation by like adding more extraterritoriality, adding additional export controls in sort of new ways, now the Biden administration is sort of taking that in and applying it in a way more sophisticated way in a very centralized White House with a National Security Council that's very organized and powerful, and that's not as divided as in the Trump administration, where you had sort of the China hawks on one hand that just wanted to beat up China, and the pentahaggers in a way that wanted to sign a trade deal and that were sort of obsessed with the trade deal that they could sign on China. There is still a lot of interagency debate, of course, with the traditionally, for instance, Department of Commerce and Department of Treasury that are, as we saw with some of the speeches by Janet Yellen, that are more sort of worried about the impact on financial markets, that don't want to hurt U.S. companies too much. Sort of in the other way, you have the National Security Council and Jake Sullivan that's more determined maybe to take more stringent measure. But this interagency debate is maybe more organized and with people more determined.
Mathilde, let me ask you about Europe. You heard there André talking about calling for a more holistic approach, the whole chain when it comes to things like electric vehicles. Who's in a better place right now? Is it a country like France, where it has to reindustrialize from scratch, since it's basically tourism and the services industry that accounts for a lot of our economy, or a country like Germany, whose model is exports and exports to places like China?
Yeah, I think that I think Germany first has a long way to go in terms of sort of managing dependencies, let's say, and maybe like realizing, especially following the Ukraine war, that depending very heavily on authoritarian powers for critical infrastructures like energy, but also we saw now with the sort of growing realization for telecom equipments that maybe relying like 40-50% on Huawei for its telecom equipment is not the best idea. And it's like true across the chain where they're sort of trying to think a bit more about managing dependencies. But what I think is the most important, especially regarding export controls that we mentioned, is that we move to better coordinate within Europe. Because, for instance, for export controls, it was much easier for the Americans to sort of bilateralize these discussions and go talk directly to the Dutch, because then they didn't have to go through the whole European discussions that take a lot more time to get any agreement and everything. And the thing is, export control is a national security issue, and therefore it's a member state competency. So member states are quite reluctant to discuss these issues at the European Union level, which is understandable in a way, since the Commission, the European Commission, has already taken a very important geopolitical role. But at the same time, it's very problematic when we see that the US are able to directly bilateralize discussion with obviously a lot more leverage than if you're talking to an entire continent.
Jean-François Huchet, you agree?
Oh yes, definitively. But I think in Europe we come from very far away. I mean, we've been for a long period of time so naive about China, and also we were promoting market-based rules opening our borders without questioning what other countries were doing. We for a long period of time, we close our eyes on reciprocity. And yes, the European Union is waking up, but waking up quite late. And I think it has been said before, I think we have to, again, think comprehensively what means to implement an industrial policy and also to think about sovereignty, which are quite difficult in a globalized industry. But it's true that the European Union wants to have a slightly different approach compared to the US as far as China is concerned. So it doesn't want also to be dragged into the US policy to cut completely or to be too severe in terms of restriction with China. But it's a very difficult path. It's going to be very difficult for Europe because I think if we are going to see a deteriorating relationship between China and the US, the European countries will have to side on one side, and I bet that it's going to be very difficult to maintain a relatively independent policy toward China.
Well, when it comes to China, we're hearing a stronger language. Europe's Internal Markets Commissioner in Japan this week, Thierry Breton, announcing plans for a supply chain deal for semiconductors with Tokyo. China not mentioned explicitly, but it sure sounds like that's who they're talking about.
It's extremely important because we share a lot of things in common. We share and we had a lot of discussions between my team and the team of the meeting in charge of semiconductors. We believe that it's extremely important to secure the supply chain of semiconductors, whatever could happen.
The MITI, of course, that organization that deals with industrial strategy in Japan. Xiaoan Chen, your thoughts on, is Thierry Breton really speaking for the European Union when he says this, or is he speaking for part of the European Union?
I think he's speaking for part of the European Union. I mean, within the European Union, regarding even China policy, it's quite diverse. I mean, even you had the German Chancellor, for instance, saying that they would rather de-risk rather than decouple, for instance. I mean, I just want to go back to the point of the de-risking and decoupling, because I feel like it's been used quite interchangeably. But I think within China, the state media themselves has said that de-risking is no different from decoupling. So I think it's very important that if Europe were to make a policy on specifically on export controls or these technology advances, I think it's very important that they pick a side in some ways.
But in this case, again, it's not Europe that's made the decision; it's the Netherlands as one country, as Mathieu was saying earlier.
Yeah, but I think even if I think for China, if the Netherlands and other states follow suit, I think it would be interpreted within China as Europe making a significant step, even if it's a small step, that this could hamper relations between the EU and China in the long term.
By the way, it was last month we were talking about Micron, the company, the US company that had been barred from the Chinese market. It's on the rebound in India, where it's part of plans to break ground on the country's first semiconductor plant next month in Gujarat. Plans to open before the end of next year. André Lezeuc-Petry, when you're the United States, you can just find another market for your product and rebound, and it's fine. Or is the U.S. really going to try to decouple with China?
Well, I think the motives of these visits that we see with Blinken and now with Yellen also shows that even from a strategic point of view, I come back always to that, it's probably not self-serving that the U.S. decouples. And on that one, I would slightly disagree, if I understood it right with the previous, with my fellow panelist. I think there is a huge difference. Remember the masks in 2020. If we decouple completely, that means we have no masks, no machines to do masks, then we are completely lost. And remember what an impact it had on our societies. If you want to produce everything in high wage country like France or Germany, it makes no sense either. But having a few machines, so de-risking, is probably the right strategy. So I think also the US realizes that it cannot completely rupture from the interconnection with the
Certainly
Chinese
when you look at the trade
economy.
imbalance between the two countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there is probably a rebalancing going on. There's also a monetary aspect to that, a dependency to who is buying a US Treasury that still is going on. And this is the risk that the US wants to strategically reduce. And let's give a bit of slack also to the European Union. It's not a country. It cannot act as one. It has, as Jean-François mentioned, come a long way. And on that one, I would think that France, knowing well both France and Germany, France is ahead in terms of strategic thinking. I mean, we are currently trying to focus on what will come next, because what we realize today is those who will lose are those who are in a defensive position. Forward, who are in the first move, the chessboard, they are the ones who are actually giving the momentum. And what I feel today is that the European Union, and Commissioner Breton is one of them, is making a lot of efforts, but it's still a little bit defensive. We react to what's happening to us. What we need is to go much more in the offensive and think about what do we need to prepare for 2024, for 2025. And I come back to this critical raw material. The embargo to Japan was 2010. We slept for the last 30 years. Now suddenly we wake up, and obviously when you wake up late, it's more expensive and you are more under pressure. And another thing which I want to address is I think we also need to execute. Think about the Inflation Reduction Act. It took a year for the US, less than a year for the US to put it in motion, and now it's bringing billions of industrial investments into the US. We need to get the speed component. I think Mathilde mentioned that before. It needs to become a European word. Today, the word speed. Today in Europe, when we have a problem, we create a fund. I think tomorrow, or we need to think also with our watch and keep the clock, because that is probably as important. And I think it depends on us. So I'm rather optimistic that we could become much more strategic. Actually, the world is putting pressure on us to become much more strategic.
Jean-François Huchet, we had earlier this week the German Chancellor telling the Bundestag, the parliament there, that they were plans for a new semiconductor factory. We've heard similar announcements here in France. We even had an announcement for the opening of a lithium mine in the center of France, in the Auvergne region. Are we going perhaps a little faster than André is saying?
Well, it's a very difficult and very complex situation regarding semiconductors. It's a globalized, totally globalized industry. Yes, there are some, as it has been said. I think the government here is trying to reindustrialize. But again, we come from very far away in France. I mean, the externalization was for the past 40 years the main, I would say, motto from most of the government. And look at what is happening in the nuclear industry. We are lacking people to build the nuclear industry, and we have to rebuild some know-how in universities, in school, to find those people. So yes, the government is moving, is trying to help, is developing some new mechanisms to help and attract investment. In France is quite good in that. A lot of investment has been made here, but let's be also I think not too much optimistic on that. I think we will have to work at the European level to be able to First, probably to compete with what's going on at the US level at the moment, and also to implement a more strategic views on other industries, because semiconductors is not the only industry where we have to think strategy.
Right, so it's perhaps more of a three-way competition. Zhao Chen, it won't be a three-way competition next week when there's that NATO summit taking place. These are military allies, and they include almost all EU nations. You're thinking on, we've been talking this whole hour about trade and the trade tensions that are rising. At the same time, this build-up to this NATO summit, we have this bounty put on the heads of Hong Kong activists. Is that linked, or is that just a different story?
No, I think it's. I don't think it's completely linked, but I think that, again, I think human rights issues has always been a concerning talking point between Western allies, and I think in the case of the NATO summit, I think the human rights record of China will essentially come up. I mean, look at what they're doing in Hong Kong, the situation in Taiwan, and the situation in all the autonomous regions. I think that this will become an issue. I think that the NATO leaders will certainly discuss certain moves they would take to ensure that China would, act according to the international standards.
Mathilde Villiers, we've had for decades a scramble for oil. For a century, in fact, we had it more than a century. Now we're having this scramble for all we need for this transition to a greener economy. Mm-hmm. You heard earlier in our conversation, André, talking about reshoring means that you're going to have dirty industries locally. How do we process this new world that we live in?
Yeah, tough question. And I just wanted to come back to something that was hinted at, and that definitely relates to your question, is that the risk with all this policies of reshoring and all this desire to build new plants, new factories, and to reindustrialize in a way, is also a real risk of subsidy race. Because if every single government wants to help its own companies and help finance plants in its own country, especially between, for instance, the US and Europe, in all the technologies that you mentioned, and particularly, for instance, in the semiconductor sector, we have a real risk of sort of every company auctioning up the subsidies with, for instance, the EU Chips Act and the US Chips Act, and everybody starting to pour money into critical industries indeed, but then it just gets the bill higher and higher, and companies can go and sort of try to negotiate with governments to get a higher contribution to their new plans. And I think that that's more complicated maybe than other issues, because then you have to coordinate, for instance, with the US, when your interest is fundamentally to have part of your industry in your own territory. So I think that's going to be an additional element in the complexity that we mentioned, in addition to the geopolitical rivalries and struggles.
Mathilde Villiers, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank as well Zhao Chen, André Lozekug-Pietri in Nancy, Jean-François Huchet in Bordeaux. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
They observe